I guess one of the things we need to do is update and actually get the thing kicked off differently because it's online. Other than that, just us sitting here silently watching you drink for a little while.
Well, I mean, we did have some technical difficulties at the beginning, so it's kind of necessary to get things set up. So they were really. I mean, the whole point is that at 6:00, we start sort of streaming and then give people time to get in. So yeah, I mean, with last time the chat was a lot more lively. There was a bunch of people chatting in there, so it was kind of nice to see that. Plus, we had two presenters who I brought on at the same time, so we were all just chatting for a little bit before we got started, catching up, stuff like that. So, yeah, I mean, people who are joining and they want to post in the chat, YouTube has that live chat thing that you can post in, and that we'll actually see that, and we can respond. If you ask questions in there, we can actually highlight them. As you can see, I'm highlighting one of the questions or one of the messages that I put in the chat. So when you're asking questions and stuff like that, I can actually show your chat on screen, and then we can make it easier to see what the question was. The live chat doesn't stay around once the stream ends, and so it's just a good way to escalate your question into the video so you can actually see it.
Right. So getting some things set up here. One thing to keep it on topic with like the whole PHP stuff. One thing I've really found really, really handy is a tool called Tinkerwell. It's made by Marcel Poicho or whatever in the Laravel community. And so I've been using it in one of the latest releases. They have the ability to SSH into a server, and you can run the Laravel commands in that folder, which is actually really cool. If you have let's say you have you're doing Docker locally and you want to run the code in the Docker environment, you can SSH into the Docker container, and then you can run your code, your debug code, or whatever it is you're trying to do, and then it just, it works. It works fantasticking.
Yeah, the first time I saw that Tinkerwell thing was on Laracast. I saw him using it, and I was like, "What is that?" And yeah, seeing it being used is pretty sweet. But yeah, I never used it. I was always just using Tinker, just locally. So, but yeah, I can definitely see a benefit of like going into a server and then poking around just on Tinker and doing some stuff.
Yeah, they're starting to come out with some really cool tools. Using that in a combination, and because I have a MacBook there, instead of Postman, I use a tool called the website is paw.cloud, and it's a HTTP, Postman-like app to do your HTTP API request, and so I use that in conjunction with Telescope, and then Tinkerwell if I need to, debug something really quickly. I think it really helps me get things done really quickly using all three of those. And of course, the standard PHP Storm or whatever IDE people use these days. Yeah. And then I just noticed Eric Van Johnson's listening. He runs the San Diego PHP Meetup group, and then a podcast called PHP Ugly, which is actually pretty funny and it's an enjoyable podcast. But what I wanted to mention about Eric, he's got a tweet out there I just saw before we came online. I think it was choose 5 dev tools you cannot live without, and then tag 5 people who should answer it. One of those meaningless Twitter things, but I thought it was interesting to start seeing everybody else's top 5 tools.
What were yours off the top of your head?
Mine off the top of my head? Well, PHP Storm, PAW. I use iTerm instead of Terminal. And I think I have to throw Tinkerwell in there. And number 5, SQL Pro.
Yeah.
How are you?
iTerm as well for me. Instead of PHP Storm, I use Sublime. And then I'd probably say Table Plus over SQL Pro. I just like Table Plus a lot more. It has some fancy stuff. And then I have this thing installed called Hammerspoon for Mac. Basically allows you to like write little scripts and apps on top of the Mac OS. And so I have one that's a clipboard manager. I have one for finding emails for people in my company. I have one that searches man pages. I have one that does autocomplete from Google, so I can like quickly check things on Google. And then I have one that also does math in a bit better because it'll copy the math to your clipboard. And so it's kind of like Alfred or whatever that thing's called, just a little bit more slimmed down. And I've written a bunch of my own scripts for it as well, so I use that quite a lot. So I'd say that one too. And then that other thing I use a lot, Cloud App, which lets you take a screenshot and automatically uploads it to their service. And so you basically take a screenshot and it gives you back a URL like as quickly as possible. It also has the ability to take GIFs and videos at the same time. So you can take a picture, a GIF, or a video, and you can screenshot that or record your screen and it'll give you back a URL. So I use that constantly just for like sharing screenshots or like sharing concepts and stuff like that. I'd definitely say that that's up there for sure too. That's the 5 for me.
Hey, Richard, our guest, how about you?
Yeah, so I'm a pretty heavy PHP Storm user, of course, and I use a lot of basic command line tools. So SSH and grep, they're big favorites. Docker, of course, great for setting up development environments. And just to throw in something a little bit different, I've been trying out this iPad app called Paper. That's really interesting for illustration anytime you're writing articles, doing presentations, doing documentation.
Nice.
Interesting. I think one of the things we're going to have to do is try and share all these links somehow. Like I had to Google Hammerspoon because I haven't heard of it, so we will try and collect all these and throw them in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be cool. Yeah.
So we'll start at 6:20. Any other interesting news in the PHP, Laravel, web dev world that you guys have seen that we can fit into 2 minutes of general chatter?
Not really. I've kind of been heads down the last couple of weeks working on some Vue stuff. I've been using Vue 3, which is interesting, or trying to. I've been using the compatibility plugin because I didn't want to install the release candidate because I'm using Nuxt. But that's been interesting. I've also been using TypeScript as well with it, so like it's like juggling 2 new things at the same time. It takes a lot of brain energy.
I bet. Yeah, I don't really have any other interesting news. I mean, Eric's tweet earlier, that was one that's fresh in my mind. I know Marcel, the Tinkerbell guy, is coming out with a course on how to build Electron apps. That might be interesting. I don't know how much work is involved in that. And then, there's always standard Laravel courses that are seeming to be really popular. I think JMac just did one on base Laravel, which, writing better PHP Laravel code. So that's a good one. I bought it, but I haven't started it. And then another one that came out, I think this came out about a month ago, and it's Jonathan Rienk had a really good course on the eloquent performance patterns, I think it's called. Okay. And I keep seeing on Twitter, there's a lot of people like saying, "Oh my God, this course changed my life. I had a 30-second query, and now it's half a millisecond."
Nice. Yeah, that stuff's always nice to see, where it's just like, just those little tips where it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden things get faster just because like you invert your thinking, or there's like a method you didn't understand what a cursor was, or you didn't understand what grouping by little super hacks in SQL.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've always felt like a framework. As much as I love and use it, it masks or it hides a lot of the I don't know, good SQL practices, for example. So people use the ORM, but they don't understand maybe how to optimize their query with the indexes or the group bys or the. But anywho, it's 6:20. We can kick this off finally and stop with the awkward talk.
Sure.
So, for the people watching, welcome. We're going to actually kick this off. And so, if you don't know what you're watching, well, we are PHP Vancouver, the remote version. It's August 2020. And if you're on Twitter, please feel free to use the banned PHP hashtag. And we have some filters set up to watch for that and retweet it. And one of the reasons why we ask for this is for our sponsor to see that, we thank them for sponsoring. However, being remote, we don't have to have any sponsors because we're not paying for your beer and pizza. But it's still nice to see, what people have to say about the meetup. I'm sure Richard, our guest, would love to hear that his talk was great. If it sucks, maybe keep that to yourself. So if you wanted to chat with us and many of the other Vancouver PHP or in general developers, we have a YVR Dev Slack. You go to yvrdev.herokuapp.com and we have a PHP channel in there. We always say it's mostly James and I posting with a few other people randomly. So come on in, get involved. Let's talk about cool things in the PHP world or in the general programming concept.
To clarify, we're the ones who post the most in the PHP channel, but there's a lot of other channels with stuff.
Yes.
I actually posted in the JavaScript channel the other day because I wanted to know about an Azure service, and someone that works on the Azure team actually responded to my question. So that was pretty cool. So I think just on top of the PHP stuff, Scott posts in the PHP stuff as well too quite a bit. But yeah, on top of that, you can definitely get other help that's not necessarily PHP, but you can definitely get some PHP stuff as well.
Nice. So we've got a sponsor slide. James, you were responsible for the slide. Do we have a sponsor?
If you go to the next slide, you'll see exactly what I did with the sponsor slide. So yeah, like Sean said, we didn't have a sponsor this month. We actually did last month, but we gave them a sweet deal. So it was our first time. But now that we've, we've got some of the rhythm down. If people were here before 6:20, they noticed that it was a little choppy at first, but that was just getting the kinks worked out. But now we kind of know how to do this. This would be our second one on YouTube. Is that right?
Yeah.
So now that we kind of know what to do and how to work this stuff, we'll get a little bit smoother. But the benefit, I think there's a big difference between sponsoring the in-person meetup and sponsoring the online meetup, is that the online meetup, that sponsorship is baked into YouTube forever. So whereas the in-person one, unless you go back to the slides after the presentations are over or go back in time and look at them, you're not going to see those sponsorships. So there's a benefit of sponsoring the remote version versus the in-person one. So I think it'd be great to we'll let you know what the in-person situation is, but as for right now, we're just sort of gonna have to stick with online, which isn't too bad. It's kind of smooth, and it allows us to get a different range of speakers who maybe otherwise wouldn't have been able to attend an in-person meetup, just because they have different obligations, or maybe they can't travel as easily as other people, or maybe it's just a huge hassle to get to the locations that we have. But that being said, if you want to sponsor the meetup, or your company wants to sponsor, like I said, this stuff is baked into YouTube forever, so it can be a good chance to sort of share stuff, and we always share this stuff online anyway, so that sponsorship is probably going to reach a bit more people, or at least a wider audience than just the people who actually walked into the room when we were doing in-person meetups.
For sure. So as always, we will have a PHP Storm giveaway, and what we usually do. Actually, James, you had the one last month. Mm-hmm. Did you ask a question, or did you just randomly pick from there?
So what I did was I picked someone from the chat. So unless you post a message in the chat saying, hey, what's up, or I'm here, or give me free stuff, your name won't be entered into the hat. So people who are watching, all of you, if you haven't posted in the chat, post in the chat just so we can get your name, and then we'll post later who the random person from the names is picked. So if you don't post in the chat, you can't get entered into to win the license. So last time we actually had someone win that already had one, and so we picked again, and we passed it off to another guy, and he was very, very grateful. So he ended up tweeting about it, the fact that he won, because he was really happy. So if you're someone who's looking for a license, and it's not just PHP Storm, we should say it's all JetBrains products, right?
Yeah.
So if you're looking for another JetBrains product, perhaps you want to play with the Go product or some of the other ones that they have, you can also use that license there. So yeah, post in the chat, and we'll pick a random person, and they'll get a license.
Great. So we're still working with the idea of getting the t-shirts, and I do have a link where I have a survey. We have some people that filled it out to get an idea of what the kind of shirt they want. We asked for the person's email so that we can email you and say, hey, we are in fact going to make this order, send us money. So not to worry, your email won't be shared for any other reasons other than us to say, we need to start collecting your money. So if you're interested, go on to the survey that's going to appear in the screen shortly, and just let us know what you're interested in. So the two concepts we have is a small logo on the chest there, and then a large logo, which would be the entire chest area. And of course, the three colors we're playing with are black, white, and purple. So again, tell us what your preference is, and we will do our best to start trying to get this going once we get enough people interested. And here is the survey. So this will be on the YouTube. We'll put it in the show notes. So please go to that link, and it's a Google form. So please let us know what you're interested in, if you are. And to finally kick it off and go to our speakers. So we have one speaker today, Richard Garand. He reached out on Meetup and said, hey, I've got this Medium post, which I think would be really interesting to talk about. And I think Richard also spoke at a different conference or a Meetup. But it's why your load test will hide problems and lead to crashes in production. I thought this is a really interesting concept and something that I don't think a lot of people talk about. So to kick it off, Richard, the floor is, oh, James, do we need to talk about online etiquette? James?
So Richard, you'll share your screen, and then we'll escalate your screen to the presentation here.
Yeah, I'll just bring that up here.
Okay, so I'll just remove ourselves, and then we'll just hide the background for you.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Garand, and this is why your load test will hide problems and lead to crashes in production. So who am I? I've been working with PHP since 1999. I've ended up working on backends for some pretty large websites, as well as APIs to support mobile apps. And I've done a variety of development, scalability, performance, and reliability work. I'm sharing some of the lessons that I've learned here. And on the side, I also run a meal service in Calgary since I lived there for a few years. I built up a lot of the online part of that, and we've reached a few thousand people at this point. So it's a much smaller scale than some of the things that I'm talking about here, but it's been a very interesting experience as well. So first, what is the purpose of load testing? Well, if you've seen crashes in production on any large or visible website, you know a lot of people will be pretty anxious about seeing that happen, and they'll want to have you find a fix for that. You might also be preparing for larger events where you expect more traffic. You can have business problems, including lost revenue, customer complaints, and even a bad reputation if your system is unreliable. And simple fixes like adding more resources or even using auto scaling won't necessarily fix everything that's going wrong. So let's take a different perspective for a moment. Let's say you want to see if someone is a good driver, so you put them in a race car on a closed course. You see how well they handle those dangerous corners, how fast they can go, and how well they manage the car. And they turn out to be really good. Does that mean that they're also going to be good if you send them to a foreign country where they don't speak the language, they're trying to navigate without a map, and they have traffic coming at them from all directions? That's a completely different situation. And I like to think about load tests the same way. If your test is done in a very artificial environment and your actual live traffic is very chaotic and different from that, then the load test doesn't necessarily tell you what kind of performance and scalability you're going to get. Another way to look at this is with our development environments. We know that if you're trying to fix a bug that you've heard about in production, you want your development environment to be very similar to that production environment so you can actually find the bug. And then once you fix it, you want to make sure your staging environment is also similar so that you can validate that fix and make sure it's actually going to work in production. So it's a pretty common concept that we want all of our environments to be very similar as much as possible. And it's the same thing when you're doing a load test. You want to make sure that the environment and the test you create for that is as similar as possible to production. Now, a lot of load testing tools, and there's a bunch out there now, they make it easy to get started, but they can also steer you in the wrong direction. It seems really simple to just put in your URL and select a number of users, but that might not always give you the test that you need. So sometimes you'll see a load test where you start it and immediately your system crashes. And it's not even the level of traffic that you would have in production. So that doesn't really reflect what's going on. On the other side, your load test might pass, but you still have crashes in production and you don't know why. All of this is information that doesn't really help you, and it comes down to a test that doesn't reflect the reality of your production environment. And the worst part of this is that you could end up spending months of development effort fixing issues that you find, and you're still seeing crashes in production. So when you're not doing the right testing and you're not finding these issues, you could have a lot of lost sales from downtime. You could have the whole team working to find and fix issues during a live event while everyone's watching. I've seen teams that have gone through both of these and have helped them to test and fix those issues so that they didn't have to keep repeating those problems. When you do this properly, you can eliminate a lot of that downtime, get a system that runs really well and handles almost any level of traffic that you're likely to see. And the best part is that a lot of these problems I found could be solved with pretty small changes. So let's go through 3 common scenarios that lead to a test that doesn't really help you. The first one is when you completely overwhelm the system. So you launch this tool and it asks you how many users you want, maybe 100,000, maybe 1 million. And that's just way more traffic than you normally get. So it's not actually useful information. For example, if you have an e-commerce site where you're doing fairly complex processing and you have high value transactions, that probably doesn't happen millions of times each day. So you don't really need to test for that level of traffic. On the other hand, you might have a content management system where you get a lot of hits, but they all go to cached pages. So it's not really creating that kind of backend load. So if you launch that load test and right away it brings down the system, hopefully that's not actually what you're experiencing in production. So you know there is a gap between your test and the actual live environment. A better example is to look at what's realistic and a good increment based on that. So with one website that I worked with, we would expect 2,000 to 3,000 concurrent users on a normal day. And when we tested for 5,000 to 10,000 concurrent users, we knew we could handle an increase. And since this was a fairly large company to begin with, if we actually saw that multiple on a regular basis, that would be pretty exciting. The purpose here is to figure out what are your realistic needs for an increase in traffic based on special events or seasonal patterns, and then test for that. So here's an example of what you might see in your results if you're doing the testing the wrong way. As soon as you add a few users, you see higher response times, you see timeouts, you see errors. And as you bring in more and more users, the system just gets bogged down and never comes back. A better test might look like this. As you add the initial users, it stays fairly stable, and then you gradually start to see slower response times, and maybe one component of the system gets overloaded, so you get some timeouts or errors. That tells you what problems you actually need to fix to get a more stable system in production. So the second example where tests can go wrong is based on cached content. Let's say you go back to that tool, you're putting in bigger and bigger numbers, and everything's perfectly stable, it's responding really quickly, but you know you're actually still having crashes in production. One reason for this might be because the load test is just hitting the same cached content every time. You're getting that from the cache, which is fast and efficient, but you're not actually creating a backend load, which is what happens in production. So in real life, when you have thousands or millions of visitors on the website, they're going to do a bunch of different operations that will not initially be cached. Some of them might be so infrequent that they never really serve the cached content. And you need to figure out what those traffic patterns are and how you can replicate them in the test. You might also have operations such as editing content where you flush the cache and you get that old information out of there. And then you're going to have a temporary increase in the load. So you have to see in your test if your system can handle that. And in some cases, you might even have a business requirement to push out updates in real time while still trying to use a cache. So you might have very limited cache lifetimes, or you might have frequent clearing of the cache. And you also need to make sure that that won't create an excessive backend load. So if you're not looking through the cache to what actually gets through and uses up the most resources, then you can't really prepare for that level of traffic. A better way to do this is to analyze what are the traffic patterns, what gets cached and what doesn't, and then create a load test script that is as close to that as possible, which doesn't necessarily mean doing thousands of unique requests as your users might, if you know the right ways to make sure those requests are getting through the cache and actually testing that backend. In some cases, if you're just looking for twice your normal daily traffic, you can rely a lot on your server monitoring tools. But if you have a rare one-time event that's going to be far more than your normal traffic, then you can't just limit yourself to that. You have to plan in advance and try to find whatever information you have about the traffic patterns that you're actually going to see and how those will affect the website. So here's another illustration of a test that will not help you, where all of the requests are just going to the same page that's cached. You're really not affecting the backend system at all. This is a better test where you might have some repetitive requests that get cached, but you also have a lot of unique requests or requests with parameters that can't be cached. So you see what happens in that case with the actual live traffic. And this needs to be comparable. For example, if 1/4 of your live requests go through the cache to the backend, then you want to try to find a similar number of requests to the backend in your load test, even if the number of actual visitors is not the same, because the cache can handle a lot more. So the third case is when you're testing the wrong bottleneck in your system. For a simple website, you might just have an application server running PHP, of course, and a MySQL database on the backend. For more complex systems, you could have several layers of CDNs and caching. You could have different application servers and services, and you could have multiple databases. If any one of those fail, then you start to get errors and slower response times. So you need to test them properly. And if you're getting a pass on one part of the system, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything else is going to hold up. To make things more complicated, you might even rely on external services that are possibly from another company, or they might just be from another team in your business that is not necessarily as responsive as you would like. In that case, you still have to understand what their limits are, test them to see how they perform, and if they're not living up to your needs, you may need to figure out some workarounds for that. So here's a little illustration where I'm trying to show a multi-layer system that has a different natural capacity at each point. So often you have caches on the front end. They can handle a lot of requests, and those are typically pretty reliable. You might have an application server in the middle that's a little bit more limited because it uses a lot more resources. And then way at the end, you might have a critical database that's actually pretty unstable and goes down really frequently. And that's an actual system that I saw. So if you focus all of your testing on the application server just to figure out how much scalability you need there, you're overlooking where the real problems may be coming from. And you want to make sure your load testing also includes that point that causes the most issues and has the lowest limits. So once you've done a load test, how do you interpret those results? The most common charts will show you things like the number of users, the response times, and the error rates, which can all be signs that something is going wrong and you're creating an excessive load. Now, those may look good or they may look bad, but they don't really tell you the full story about what's going on. As you're doing the test, especially when you see those slower responses and you start to see the errors creep up, you want to look into the servers at each level of the stack and look at different metrics to see if some of them are getting close to their limits, even when the test is running out okay, or if some of them are indicating where you're having a problem and something is getting overloaded. Typically, when a problem comes up, you might see it affect multiple layers of the stack. So you want to try to find those metrics that indicate where the problem originated and not focus too much on the ones that were simply caused by that original problem. As an example, you might do a load test where you see things slowing down and you're getting errors, and you observe your web servers running out of memory. And you might think we can just add more memory, or we can auto scale the group and get some more servers in there, and everything should be fine. But if you're actually getting a lot of processes on those servers that are just waiting for a response from another service that's starting to fail, then that's not going to really help. And in fact, the more servers you have, the more requests you're making, and the problem can get even worse. So you need to look at a bunch of different metrics all across the stack and try to understand where the failures actually originate and how you can fix them. Once you do that, you can repeat the test to make sure that the fix worked and look if there are any other issues that were hidden behind that failure. So a good load testing process has a lot of benefits. In one team that I worked with, whenever they did a major promotion that brought in extra traffic, for example, a Cyber Monday sale, the website might be down by 9 a.m. So clearly they were losing a lot of sales from that. Some testing helped to identify the problem, and it turned out that a very simple change with just a few lines of code could almost entirely prevent that and do it in a way that was fairly transparent to the users, so no one really noticed what was going on. Once this was implemented, we tested it thoroughly. It went into production. They did some promotions. Everything ran fine. The website was very stable, and they now had the ability to do this anytime they needed to hit revenue goals, which was a pretty big deal for them. In another website that I worked with, it ended up being that a major bottleneck was the AWS database, because even the maximum instance size couldn't handle the workload. And at that point, there was really no option to increase the resources on that server. Now, typically, you might think of using read replica instances to add more capacity, but the code base wasn't written for that, and it would take a lot of work to adapt to that. So by finding the actual bottleneck that was causing the issues, we were able to implement a fairly quick solution where we put a SQL proxy in place that could distribute the queries to multiple different instances, and it also did some of its own caching. That instantly unlocked a lot more database capacity, took away the biggest bottleneck, and through repeated testing, we saw that the site could handle a far higher level of traffic just from that one simple change. And the best part was that after previous very difficult experiences, we were able to do multiple tests showing how stable the site was. And when the day of the event came, everything ran perfectly smoothly, and the team didn't have to worry about that. So to wrap this up, even though a lot of tools can lead you in the wrong direction if you just stick to their defaults, you can use them to create a sequence of requests that generate the right traffic pattern. Or in some cases, I've even created 5 to 7 load tests that I launch at the same time. They each do different types of requests, and that can create the right patterns to simulate the complex interactions that you might see in production and make sure you're prepared for that. In other cases, I've created simple scripts that will just loop through a bunch of different variations and send off those requests, so I can create any level of unique traffic that doesn't get cached and see how the system responds to that. You need to look first at what actual scenario you're trying to replicate, and then figure out the best way to do that so you can run a good test. the goal here is to understand the real load at each possible failure point in the system and see what you need to optimize so you can get the performance you need at the desired target and even leave a little room for error in case you get additional traffic or if something unexpectedly slows down on when you get that extra traffic. And starting from your actual realistic traffic, you can test incrementally higher loads, hopefully get to the goal that you're trying to hit. But if you realize that you can't support the traffic that you're trying to get to without major changes to the system, that's also useful to know. When you do this, you can end up being the hero, because I've seen teams that have struggled with crashes for years, and just knowing that they don't see those crashes anymore and they have these tests to show how stable the system is, they were really excited to see that and to know that they could go back to all of their other responsibilities and not worry about this. And I know a common saying in the meetup here is to learn something that will help you make more money tomorrow. So if you guys are facing a situation where you need to prepare for more traffic, I hope you can use this to make sure that everything is stable and everyone's happy with what you've done with the system. So to finish this off, I'm starting to post more on Twitter about this and other related topics. You can follow me there at Richard_G, and I'm here to answer any questions that you have.
Sean, you're muted.
There we go. Always the professional here. So, Richard, thank you for your talk there. So, I have a couple questions, and then we also should have some questions in the chat that we could also go over. One of the questions I have when I think back to when I was concerned about these kind of costs, these kind of the load balancing. So it was an early stage startup, and what we were concerned about was how much is our server cost going to be if we hit that viral network effect type of event. But it was a startup, so not enough money, but we couldn't really set up any load tests against the server because otherwise our AWS bill would go up. Do you have any advice on how to handle that? Like, is it something where you have to pay the cost if you want to know whether you can stand up to the server traffic?
Yeah, so that depends on the situation. And one extreme that I've referred to here was when it's an annual event with a level of traffic that is just far beyond anything comparable on any other day. What we did was actually run up that full environment and run the test on it. Obviously not the cheapest option, but that was the way to get the confidence that everything was ready and everything would work. If that's not possible, on the other extreme, if you have kind of a regular daily level of traffic, you could look at the metrics from that and try to identify what's getting close to the limit, what might be our first point of failure, and then do some more focused tests on that. But beyond that, if you're kind of restricted in the resources available and you want to be prepared for more traffic than you've seen before, you can try to analyze and do limited tests, but it becomes unfortunately, it can be a bit of a theoretical question where you might get to that point and see something that you didn't expect and have to work to fix that.
Yeah, just we wanted to remind the people that are watching to ask your questions in the live chat so we can escalate those to the video, and then Richard can ask them if there's anything there. So we'll give some people some more time to gather their questions. I had a question. So is there some tools that you typically reach for that are maybe a bit more platform agnostic? You mentioned AWS a couple of times, but I've used AB in the past to load test, my own DigitalOcean boxes and stuff like that. So is there anything that you would reach for as far as what your go-to tools are and what you would do for these, I guess they're integration load tests is sort of what you're advocating, right? Versus I did a unit load test, I load tested the database, but then you missed all the caching, you missed the front end, you missed everything. So yeah, do you have some go-to tools for that type of stuff?
Yeah, exactly. So typically what I'm talking about is mostly load tests that are run from the perspective of the user. So they really are those integration tests, and they're even coming externally from the development environment. So common tools like JMeter and BlazeMeter work well for that. And also, as I mentioned, if you need to create a whole bunch of different requests, instead of programming that into the tool, you can write a script that will generate those for you.
We actually do have a statement here from the audience. It sounds to me like the best way might be to allow jQuery and JavaScript to handle some of the business rules instead of using PHP for transforming the data to keep messaging to a minimum. Is that right? I assume this is sort of like talking about dividing your workload maybe in a different way, like leveraging the client more than leveraging the server. Have you sort of had you talked a lot about the load balancing and then some of the solutions. Have you had some things where you've had server stuff shift off the server or shift around the application in different ways?
Yeah, so that's kind of a broader question of whether, if I'm understanding this right, it's a question of whether it should be processed on the back end or the front end. And there's a whole bunch of different trade-offs to that. And one kind of sidebar to some of these tests that I mentioned was a little thing that we didn't really quite get around to, but there was this need to get information updated and published and through the cache really quickly. And what I wanted to try out there was to modify the front end JavaScript a little bit so that instead of regenerating the whole page, it would do a separate request for a JSON file and read the content out of there, which means we could push that out and get it through the cache without all of the other bulk of processing the page. So depending on your specific constraints and needs, there are a lot of solutions that can involve that. But when it comes down to some of your core business logic and especially permissions and restrictions on what's allowed, a lot of that has to be in the back end. So that's where I've focused a lot of this load testing to solve those constraints.
You mentioned the load balancer you put in front of the database. How was that something in AWS that you set up, or was that like you actually put like a HA proxy in front of your database? Like, can you talk more about this app specific solution there?
Yeah, so that was really interesting. I hadn't actually used it before, but it performed really well. And there's a few options that I found. I believe one is an open source Apache project. This one was a commercial project called Heimdall, and it's available standalone. It's also available as a one-click install in AWS, which is what we used. And it's a very transparent query proxy. You point all of your web servers to that instance as the database. And you can also set up a scaling group with a load balancer, so you can have multiple instances. And then they go to either your master database or the read replicas, depending on the type of the query. They have a kind of replication window, so you're not writing to the master and then 1 millisecond later expecting to get that updated value out of another database instance. And they also do some simple caching on their own, so they won't even touch the database if it's not really necessary. And what we found was that even with a really high level of traffic, the read replicas were not really doing that much because a lot of this local caching took care of the basic queries, and then the single master instance could handle what was left over. But we still had several database instances just to be prepared for absolutely anything.
So do you have an idea of, like, it sounds like a lot of the time the load testing was like finding maybe a problem that already existed versus like preparing for an eventuality. But do you have any strategy on like, okay, well, there's no point in is there any point in load testing when I have 10 concurrent users versus load testing when I have 10 customers and each customer has 10,000 concurrent users? Like, obviously load testing is one of those things where it's like, if you can afford to do it, you should do it versus, I'm on a team of 3 people. If we're low, do you think we should be load testing, or like what scale do you think we should be looking at? Or is it something that needs to be on the radar? Like, how do you sort of know when to actually apply this type of stuff? Because it can mean like drastic changes to your infrastructure, right? If you're adding a proxy or adding read slaves to your, or I guess I should say read clones to your actual system, what is that? How does that relationship work with team size, request size in terms of concurrency and stuff like that?
Yeah, for sure. And that's where, with pretty much everything I've referred to, this was instances where more or less the load we were preparing for was something that had been observed in the past, so that there was historical experience with that. We knew it was already at that point or would be soon, and it was basically businesses and organizations that got to the point where if you see those failures, there's a lot of anxiety going around. So that's kind of the context for a lot of this. If you're doing something that's a little more like trying to be predictive and forecast the load, you could do some of that, but in a lot of cases, you might see the nature of the application and the business change by the time you get to that point. So if you're looking at whether you'll hit 10 or 100 or 1,000 times what you've seen at some point in the next year or two, that's a little bit harder to prepare for. And I think it comes down to the basic rule that premature optimization is most often unproductive work and sometimes even holds you back.
There's a thing by Netflix called Chaos Monkeys that I've always been really interested in and read about how they introduce that in their system where they have multiple services and just have this script that the Chaos Monkey go in, turn off some of the services, and we'll see how all their other microservices will stay online or respond to something being down, like how they handle that. Is something like that in any part of your load balance, your load testing strategy, or is that something extra?
Yeah, it's something I've done once in a while. Even at a basic level, you can just start a load test and then 5 minutes later go kill some servers and see what happens. And that can be useful. It can kind of show you what's the fallback and how quickly, for example, if you have AWS autoscaling, which I've used quite frequently, how quickly that's going to replace those servers and how that affects things. I think it's kind of a separate thing in a sense that if you have, let's say, a one-time surge in traffic, or you have a daily baseline and one day you get twice that, there are certain predictable problems if your system is not architected and provisioned in a way to handle that capacity. And that's what I look to focus on with the load testing. But that's separate from getting to that level, having everything running smoothly, and then you start to lose servers due to a random error. That's a bit more of an error handling and reliability issue that it's often separate from just the concept of preparing for that level of traffic.
So we got a question from Wilson Wong, who watching along. So have you looked into solutions where services auto-scale, i.e. spin up a new server if the load is greater than, say, 75%?
Yeah, that's definitely a help, but as I referenced several times in here, that doesn't necessarily solve the actual problem, and I've seen that in different ways. One issue is that the basic auto-scaling, it launches a full server instance and takes a few minutes to boot up, so you have some lag in the response time. Another issue is that you can set certain metrics. For example, the CPU limit is a very common one. When you get to a certain level of CPU, you start new instances. But what if your CPU is really low and you're running out of memory because you have all these processes hanging around waiting for something to be done? In that case, you're not really getting that response because the CPU is not that high. So you kind of have to look at those different scenarios and see what happens. And that's again something where that's a very specific metric to that part of the stack, and it doesn't necessarily address why that CPU ran up or why you had some other issue while the CPU usage was still very low.
Good.
Do you think setting like so I mean, like a lot of this stuff could be solved with like, there's the architecture side of like, oh, I'm adding proxies, I'm adding caches, I'm adding replication. What about things like just having some sort of like minimal, or I guess some rudimentary defaults for like auto scaling? Because I guess if you have like a regular application that's it's got your API and your front end, depending on how you do your front end, it might just be a statically served from a CDN. So the scalability there is like you might be leveraging how scalable is a file system essentially with that thing. But then you have your API, which is typically where the actual real work is happening. So a lot of the solutions are going to be on that side. But is there So like, do you think that there's probably some room for a product, or like maybe even just sane defaults for templates for AWS or even Azure and Google that have a bit more of a like conservative auto scaling setup? So I mean, like a lot of the solutions could be, create replications of your database when you get to that certain CPU limit, or increase the size of your instance if you get to that certain CPU limit, which I believe are all things you can do, but it's just like you have to manually set those versus like what you were describing of like the post-mortem investigation of like something went wrong and then discovering that through the load testing and figuring out, okay, well, why did it crash or why did it fail? Do you think there's probably like, I mean, it'd be nice if these services offered, some sort of templates for this type of stuff where, hey, if you're using, SQL with PHP, it'd be great if you, do this type of setup where it's like you can auto scale your app instance, you can have your database replication work in like the most common case. Do you think, is there anything like that? Or is that something that you think will come? Or is that something you think there's room for in like the market?
Yeah, I think there's room for some of those fundamental architectural changes. And one big one that I'd really like to see is that, as I mentioned, auto scaling often involves a delay of a few minutes. Now, if you're familiar with other architectures, you might know that Kubernetes, for example, can add instances almost instantly, but that's a much more complex environment that takes a lot of work to configure and maintain. So I would like to see hosting providers give a basic service that's like the self-contained auto scaling, but it gives you that kind of instant start. And maybe there's some constraints on that, but at least you can add capacity really quickly. Beyond that, I think a lot of these are very specific to your architecture. So for example, the database, if it's written just based on the actual constraints of using a database, if it's written to target everything towards a single server, it can take a lot of work to split that up between multiple replicas, which is where that SQL proxy ended up being really useful. And in other cases, as I said, if you have scaling rules on a certain group and you're increasing that, that might mean you actually have more load that you're creating somewhere else down the line, and that can create other issues that you have to deal with. So I think it's really, a lot of it comes down to your analysis of what's important, what are the constraints, and what issues do you anticipate? What have you found from live traffic? What have you found from load testing? I will throw in one thing that I've seen a lot with auto scaling groups. It's really the first thing that makes me ask questions right away is when I look at auto scaling rules that say after the load has been this high for 10 minutes, we'll add one server, and then we'll wait 15 minutes before adding another server, which means you've got pretty much a 25 to 30-minute delay built in there. Mm-hmm. And if you've been on a conference call with 5 to 10 people trying to figure out why the site is down, 25 minutes feels like a long time. So
yeah,
my preference is to add a server after 1 minute, add another server after 1 minute, keep going like that, and then have a cleanup rule where after 15 minutes of low load, you remove a server. So you're kind of flipping that, and you're adding capacity as soon as you can, and then if you don't need it, you can take it away gradually. But you don't want to delay in that scenario.
Wouldn't that just mean like setting reduced thresholds for the scaling group? Like instead of auto scaling when it's the CPU's at 70, you could auto scale when it's at 50.
Yeah, you could do that. That's going to give you more up and down because it's going to sometimes it's going to get triggered and add a new server. But that's my principle, that it's typically better to have an extra server than not.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to call out was there's what it is. It's an app called Fathom Analytics. So they're an analytics, privacy-focused analytic tracking, kind of like a Google Analytics competitor. And so they posted on their blog this morning, which was a really interesting read, very similar to what you've talked about, where they had one of their analytics customers go viral, and it wasn't that they were able to have, they were predicting to be able to handle millions of requests, but I think this particular site went like incredibly viral and got hundreds of millions of requests, if not hundreds of tens of millions of requests, in their analytics event just got bottlenecked. It was a really interesting read. I don't want to say anything about what they did to solve it or how they found it, because I enjoyed reading it step by step, because the way they wrote it is almost like a story with twists and turns and everything. It was a really fantastic read to kind of get an idea of what they went through to solve these bottlenecks they had. So if anybody is interested in that, I'll make sure to share it in the show notes. But it's Fathom Analytics. You can go to their blog if you don't want to wait. But again, and a very interesting story that I think touched on a lot of the things that you talked about today as well. And aside from that, we have another question that came from Slack from one of our listeners who was like, I'm going to say he's a friend of mine and he's too lazy to make a YouTube account. So how would you test throughput in a disk or S3 bound system, i.e. a bunch of people uploading images at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at kind of the breadth of that and how many different people can upload images at the same time, you kind of have to create that situation. And if you really need to have a bunch of different sources to really recreate the patterns that you expect, then you might look at maybe creating a script to auto launch instances that each send their own files. But it really comes back to getting as close as you can to the actual traffic patterns and making sure your test is relevant to the live environment.
So that would mean, are you like actually just straight up load testing on S3 then?
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, with the resources that Amazon has, of course, they can publish a lot of data and they can give you some baseline expectations. But I've seen some interesting load tests on S3 and on AWS services that show you that what you see on the documentation might not, what you interpret that as might not be what you actually get. So that can sometimes be a good load test to run.
Do you see like this sort of preparing for scale, like, to just sort of like put a bucket on this whole conversation? Do you feel that that's more of a DevOps thing, or is that more of a application programming thing? Because I mean, in the Laravel world, like you can do a lot of stuff before you actually have to like start editing your infrastructure. For example, using Redis for sessions and caching and all these types of things, or using a cloud file system versus using the local file system. Like you can kind of the programmer or the developer can actually sort of make some of these decisions initially before having to escalate to like, oh, I need to add more databases or I need to do XYZ to actually get my application to run. Do you feel that that's more like, where do you think that balance is between having like knowing AWS it's a lot of information. It's like I've really when I first learned about it, I learned a little bit of the raw stuff, but then I ended up using Ansible for doing a lot of the like setting of things just because it was way more approachable. I didn't have to worry about like what version of the API I was on, blah blah blah. And like once I was kind of done and I'd set everything up, I just kind of like left it, and it was just it's all in Ansible, run Ansible, blah 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 blah, and it just does it all for you. Versus like having to actually know that information and be able to like know the statistics on like when is S3 likely to fail, or knowing like, okay, well, what is that server CPU usage that actually is going to push me over the limit, versus like just setting up your application from day one to sort of try to get ahead of some of these things, or try to find the best way to prepare yourself so you can maybe not put it off, but make it so that when you're actually making these decisions, they're being made at a high level where it actually will make a real difference versus like what you said, the premature optimization stuff.
Yeah, and I think the good news is that there are a lot of quick wins. There are tools that are easy to use and make a big difference. But of course, they don't always necessarily make a difference. So if you have, let's say you've got a website where there's 1 million anonymous visitors that are just getting cached content and 300 people that are logged in, you might not really need a Redis cache for the sessions because that's such a small portion of the activity. So it really depends on how the system grows up, how the traffic grows up, how the business grows up, and what impact that actually has. And that's kind of what I look at for the most part when a lot of things have been implemented well, and that's why I refer to AWS a lot. It absolutely generalizes to any environment you want, but AWS is often a first step between a single server and a fully scalable environment, and it gives you some pretty easy to use tools for that. But what I'm showing here is that there are also limits to that, and you have to understand beyond your individual Laravel application or beyond your individual Drupal or WordPress website, what's the bigger perspective? How do those fit together, and how are they each affected? So you can look at that whole system, and as you see cracks start to emerge, even with a lot of those best practices in place, you can find what's going on and hopefully fix them in an efficient way.
So you mean you can actually, like, don't let me put words in your mouth, but I think what you were saying was that you can kind of cheat a little bit by using AWS and not having to like build this like insanely robust application, because you can actually leverage the infrastructure of AWS to help you there. Was that sort of what you're saying?
Yeah, it gives you really good basic tools with the auto scaling or simply increasing your instance size. So if you can use those, I always prefer a few clicks in an online console over a few
Right.
months of engineering time. So
Yeah.
that's an easy starting point. But when you hit the limits to that, and when that's not responding to what you need, that's when you might need to look at more complex analysis at least, and hopefully not a major re-architecting of the system. But
But I
that
guess,
really depends, because you can see you can get to a point that's very different from what you expected 2 years ago, and it may be that you had no way of preparing for that ahead of time.
yeah, that's what I was going to say, was that, I mean, a lot of these problems, like the scaling problem is a problem of success, right? Like,
Yeah.
unless you've royally messed up your infrastructure where, you made all the wrong decisions and everything's tightly coupled to like a stateful server that has to stay there and be on. It's not, you're dealing with problems of success. Like I was saying, you have too much traffic. Oh, I guess you should
Yeah.
probably solve that problem now, versus like, well, I just said Laravel new blah 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 blah, and it's week 2 of my site being live, and now I'm thinking about what's going to happen when I reach 100,000 concurrent users, and I'm hitting the limits of S3 disk writes, but yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
cool.
mean, if you should be so lucky to go from a tiny unknown website to that huge viral sensation overnight, there are basic tools that help with that, like just having good caching and a CDN in place. If you can serve even 24-hour-old content, if you can collect email addresses, that there's $100 bills falling out of the sky, and your bucket isn't as big as you want, but it's not the worst day.
Yeah. John, looks like we had another Slack question. Sean, you're muted.
This was a follow-up from the previous question about people uploading a bunch of images at the same time, but not so much testing the S3 layer, but more on the API app where you would pre-process and send to S3, and how to distribute the test across multiple machines auto-magically. Are there tools to do this?
Yeah, so I guess just to answer the tooling question, I haven't really looked at that kind of multiple upload scenario. I guess I know some of these tools have a variety of advanced options, and I think there are some for actually uploading files. So you could use some of these hosted tools like BlazeMeter, where they can run a bunch of different requests from different origins, and all of them are uploading files. And I think that might be a good way to create that test. Or if it comes down to it, if you have to create your own script, you'd probably want to find a way to launch that across a bunch of different instances, so you're maximizing the bandwidth that you're throwing into the test. And I'm not sure if that is a question about testing the structure as well, but if you're trying to see what's the minimum test you need to actually see that limit, you would want to see, I mean, you basically need to look at that chain of constraints from the upload itself to the application server to S3, and look at each of those points to see what you can test there. And maybe you can find some ways to simplify that a little bit, but it's a bit of a different problem. So I'd have to look at that, just starting with the upload features in some of the basic and common tools.
Awesome. Don't think we have any other questions. nothing else in the chat. James,
Yes.
any questions from you?
No, I think I injected enough of my questions. Yeah, I think it was great to know. I guess everyone. I feel like what you were saying was like that limit of that delay of like a few minutes before something like auto scales, and then you refresh the page and it's all of a sudden alive. Like I think a lot of people have dealt with that where those spikes in traffic, and I think it's great to understand and know how to get ahead of that stuff, or like at least how to find out if what happened when stuff went down. So I think it's great to know. Regardless of whether or not you're writing PHP, it's good to know this stuff and or at least have a working knowledge and be able to speak the lingo and be able to say, oh, are we auto scaling? Are we proxying? Do we have read replicas and stuff like that? So yeah, thanks for presenting to us.
Yep, my pleasure. Thanks for hosting this tonight.
Thank you, Richard. So wrapping up, thanks again to our awesome sponsors.
I guess JetBrains is our real sponsor at the moment. Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Like we said at the beginning, post a comment. The comment can be a question mark. It can be an exclamation point. It can be a hey, what's up? If you, as long as you posted a comment, you're entered into the giveaway to actually win a PHP Storm license. Like we said at the beginning, it's not just a PHP Storm license. If you're already a subscriber of PHP Storm, you've paid your 2020 bill, you can actually use this license for any JetBrains product. So just also another note, if you win this license, please use it. If you're not going to use it, please give it to someone who will use it, because JetBrains will stop giving us licenses to give away if we're giving them away and they're not being used. So just keep that in mind. If you do win, please try to use this license, use it on a JetBrains product, give something a shot. If you're not going to personally use it, give it to someone you know who needs it, or just decline the prize and we'll pass it off to the next person who's willing to take it. So yeah, again, paste a comment in the live chat. That'll enter you into win the giveaway.
We had one last minute late question. Richard, do you have a blog?
Not at the moment. I have the Twitter account that I mentioned before, and I'm writing a few articles on Medium for now. So those are the best place to follow me.
Awesome. Thank you. So just a reminder about the t-shirt. Here's the Google Forms link. Let me know if you're interested in 1 or 2 or 10. Size, color, send your email so that we can follow up and get your money and get these ordered. And then getting involved. So like Richard, he was able to give us a talk, and we would love to hear from a lot of the people either in Vancouver, or we might start reaching out to outside Vancouver, and because it is remote, and seeing if there's anybody who maybe there's someone who lives in northern BC or the island that wasn't able to come to our downtown Vancouver events. But we can also expand it to other provinces and states and so forth, with preference to Vancouver, BC-based people first, but definitely open to having more people speak and learning about different things. Like Richard was able to talk about something that was really interesting to me, but I didn't necessarily know a ton about. So please reach out and hit us up. And
yeah, thanks so much.
And of course, Twitter, please feel free to follow us, retweet, share. I guess we can't share pictures, but if you want to take a screenshot, I'm not going to be opposed. No, thank you all, and we'll see you in a month.
See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Will we end broadcast, James?